Good, good. Happy to see that. Hopefully there's no one else in the ditch right now. Hopefully everyone who intends to be here is here right now. So we are in our 4th week of the series, Scared of the Old Testament, where we are going through the entire Old Testament. You might have figured out by now that we're probably not going to get through the entire Old Testament. We are, however, I'm trying to get through the actual narrative arc of the Bible. So we will be talking a little bit about, let's say, certain prophets during this time, but we're not going to cover the prophets. We're not going to cover the sort of the wisdom books. We're not going to cover Proverbs and Psalms and all that. But we are going to try to get into our heads what happens when. And because for myself, for my biblical study, I certainly didn't have a good grasp of that until I'm ashamed to admit how long it took me to have a good grasp of what the actual arc is. So, here is what we've done so far. We are, as I said, in week 4. We're in the kingdom of Israel and Judah, because that was something that I really want to drive home, because I was in my Old Testament archaeology class. And I went to a Christian college, and I remember sitting in my class, and all of a sudden, we're talking about the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel. And it was one of those moments where you're kind of you're reading a book, and all of a sudden, you're 2 pages ahead of where you thought you were, and you're oh wow, I'm still reading, but you have no idea what you're reading. It was like that when the kingdom of Israel and Judah was mentioned to me. I'm just wait, whoa. Where did this happen? Where did they split into 2 kingdoms? I always thought that Israel was the entire thing, and then Judah. So and again, if I'm informing you of anything that you already know, excuse me, but did you guys know that the word Jew comes from Judah? Does everyone know that? So when we say Jewish, we are actually referring to the particular tribe of Judah. Because the way that they talk about it, at least right now, they say that there are 10 lost tribes of Israel. And that the 10 lost tribes are not Benjamin and Judah. Those are the 2 tribes that are not lost. All the other ones, according to at least the Jews right now, they are gone and they got lost when they got carted off to Assyria. Anyways, we'll get into that. But that's one of those things where it's the word Jewish comes from Judah. Okay, so we're going to do a brief recap of where we are so far, just to drill home what the actual narrative arc is. So we had the creation of the world. God creates the world out of nothing, and then humanity is made, and then humanity sins and falls. Things go from bad to worse, and we sort of end up at the Tower of Babel, where people are talking and they're not making sense to each other. They tried to build a monument to themselves to reach up to the heavens to say that they are better than God. They are not better than God. God confuses them. And then what's going to do? Things are bad. Then God chooses Abraham to be the family. His family, his descendants, is going to be how God saves the world. And so that's great, right? Except Abraham makes a whole bunch of mistakes. There's a famine. His family ends up in Egypt. Egypt ends up enslaving the Israelites, or at least the Israelites. And then we get Moses, who takes them out of Egypt because they're in bondage, and they get out of Egyptian slavery, and they cross the Red Sea, and then they establish a covenant on Mount Sinai. There's some bad things that also happen there. They get the law, they get the covenant, they wander through the wilderness in the book of Numbers. All sorts of bad things happen there, and they wander partially because of how obstinate they are. They refuse to follow the Torah. They refuse to follow the law. And then finally, they make it to the Jordan River, about to cross into the Promised Land. Except this is not the generation that escaped Egypt. This is their children, because the generation above them was so obstinate that they didn't listen to God. That's Moses. He gives a speech in Deuteronomy basically saying choose life. Either you're going to choose life, follow the Torah, or you're going to choose death. And if you choose death, God's curse is essentially going to be upon you. And I don't want you to think of curse as a bad thing per se. It's sort of the natural consequences of not following God's law. It's not, it's sort of like you kind of want God to curse you because you want to follow God's way, if that makes sense. But I'm going quickly, but I just want to sort of establish this arc. They cross the Jordan River, and then they make it to the Promised Land, and things are going to be awesome in the Promised Land. If they follow God's Torah, if they listen to what they say, and they actually go through and essentially remove the people that are inhabiting the Promised Land, the Canaanites, because of their practice of child sacrifice as well as other sexually devious things, they will inherit the Promised Land and there will be no problems whatsoever. And that's what is supposed to happen in the book of Joshua. But we know that things start out well. Obviously, we all know the story of them surrounding the kingdom of Jericho and walking around and doing exactly what God says. But as they go on and try to eliminate the other tribes, they start to get a little bit, not following what God told them to do. And things go so far, and this is another little bit of a recap. We're in the Promised Land, and then they start killing all the Canaanites. Remember, this is the king of Moab. I know it's a little bit brutal looking there, but what ends up happening is instead of doing that, they themselves become like the Canaanites. They, in fact, become, in some cases, worse than the Canaanites. They did not follow God's Torah. They deserve God's judgment. They become worse than the Canaanites. So what's going to happen now? What's going to happen to the family of Abraham, the Israelites, now that they haven't actually followed God's Torah? That's what we're going to find out now. The way that it ended last time in Judges was, in those days they had no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So just to recap, because again, I'm going to just drive this home because I think this arc is so important. We have Genesis, Exodus, and then the creation, and then the fall, and this is where some laws are given, and this is where they went to the desert. This is where Moses gives a speech telling them to choose life, to follow God's Torah, and this is where they have a chance to first follow God's Torah and to remove the Canaanites from their land because of their improper, immoral practices. And this is where we are. And you see, too, though, that after Judges and Joshua, you get Ruth. And I want to talk about that a little bit because, let me see. Okay. I want to talk about those three books a little bit before we move on first. Because the reason why we're going in such quick succession is we can focus on the particular stories of the Bible to our detriment sometime. I think when you read Joshua, then Judges, and then Ruth, you get a whole different picture than if you were to just read just Joshua, and then just Judges, and then Ruth. Because I think that when you read the Bible, I think it's constantly full of surprises. Because in Joshua, I think what we learn is that, if you were to follow to the letter of the law what God is telling them to do, to essentially, and this makes us uncomfortable, right? But it is God's law. If they were to actually slaughter, let's just be honest, if they were to kill those Canaanites, that would be following God's letter of the law. And that's what they were supposed to do. And because they didn't, in some ways they get God's curse. And that's what happens. And obviously we see that in Judges. We see that they did not follow God's letter of the law to a T. And what ends up happening is these sexual practices, the child sacrifice, starts to infect the Israelites so much. So what God told them was going to happen ends up happening. And that's obviously that's what the Israelites had coming in some way. But I think the really not fun, but the thing that is surprising about all of this, and this is why I think it's sometimes important to talk about these books in quick succession, is that the next book that follows those horrible books of Joshua and Judges is the book of Ruth. In the book of Ruth, we have a Moabite. For whatever reason, we have someone who is a non-Israelite, and God chooses her to show how God's essentially plan for the world, his saving plan for the world. And it's a surprise. It is a surprise. We shouldn't expect there to be a non-Israelite to save the Israelites, because we essentially just heard from God, and I think that's right, that we were supposed to essentially kill all these people. But God works in surprising ways. Just like the Jews expected a king, like a very, very powerful king, to be the actual Messiah. Instead, what we have is a lowly carpenter. It's very surprising. So I think why I like to do this so quickly is sometimes when you do focus on individual stories, you actually lose the bigger picture. And I think God, what's interesting about the Bible is, in some ways, obviously the Messiah was there the entire time. From the first page of the Bible, meaning Genesis, we are actually learning about this coming king who's going to save the world. And they talk about how this king essentially is going to come up and he's going to destroy the snake that essentially has tricked Adam and Eve. But he's going to get a fatal wound, and it talks about the snake biting the heel of the future Messiah. So they've been talking about the Messiah the entire time, but they had in their mind what they thought that should be. But what ends up happening is the Messiah comes, and they're not fully aware, maybe in part because they didn't actually see some of the connections that are in the Bible. So anyways, so this again, I've shown this before. I don't know if I did a good job of talking about this, but this is a visual representation of cross-references. And I don't know if you know, excuse me if you do, but we're just going to talk about a cross-reference real quick, because there's a particular type of cross-reference that I'm get to sort of intro 1 Samuel. So a cross-reference in the Bible is a connection between different parts of the Bible, such as verses, people, phrases, or locations. And apparently I have to put this on there twice. And this, if you are kind of a nerd, it's like reading the bibliography almost at the end of a book. These, it's sort of advanced, but as you can see, the book of Job is right there at the beginning of the book, and that's God. I think Job 38 is where were you when the sun. I don't know if you know how well you know Job, but basically Job is having this existential crisis. His family all died, and God is basically saying to him where were you? Who are you to question me? Where were you when I created the world? That's a cross-reference. So the Bible is constantly talking about each other. And one of those ways that the Bible talks about each other is location. So at the very end of Judges, as I said, in those days Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. That is the very end of Judges. And what do we know about what happens in 1 Samuel? Does anyone know what happens in 1 Samuel? Who we get introduced to? We get introduced to Saul. So right there, that word king, we're supposed to, we should know that, we're going to be talking about kings now. We're going to be, this is the first time that Israel starts to get, has just like the rest of the nations around them, they're going to get a human king, and that king is going to be Saul. And maybe the king is going to solve their problem. Maybe the whole issue this entire time of them sinning and falling away from God and not following God's Torah has been because they don't have a human king to tell them what to do. So there's also some other little connections that I thought that was very cool that I wondered out loud to myself, I wonder if there's a connection between the end of Judges and the beginning of 1 Samuel. So I hadn't heard this from anyone else. This was my own Bible study. And sure enough, like what I saw, and this is what I told you at the end of last class, was it says in the hill country of Ephraim. And what in the hill country of Ephraim, what's very interesting about that phrase, so the hill country of Ephraim is where the Levite and his concubine are from. And I didn't actually tell you this particular story that happens in that, and I don't know if you actually looked at the end of Judges 19 through 21. But essentially, so essentially he's from the hill. Sorry, it's a brutal story, and like Alan says that I should tell the story, but anyway, what ends up happening is it's a Sodom and Gomorrah-like story. Okay, he ends up staying the night in a town called Gibeah, the Levite and his concubine, and essentially the inhabitants of Gibeah would like to sleep with the men of the party, just like it happens in Sodom and Gomorrah. And what ends up happening instead is remember what happens in Sodom and Gomorrah when they where they threaten to throw the virgin daughters out into the town square, instead of having the men of the party being essentially ravaged by the men of the town. That's what ends up happening. And in the Sodom and Gomorrah story, God actually intervenes. He's like, we need to get out of this town now. I'm about to essentially throw fire and brimstone down. And what actually happens in the Levite and concubine story is the concubine gets thrown out into the town square, and bad things happen. And essentially, in the morning, the Levite enters the town square. The concubine is dead, and they go back to the hill country of Ephraim, and this is where it gets really bloody. They cut up the concubine into 12 pieces, and they send it through the entire kingdom of Israel, and a civil war breaks out. Essentially, everyone gangs up against the Benjamites, and that's where Gibeah is. Gibeah is in where the tribe of Benjamin is. So it is a brutal ending of that, and that's after that all happens, and after they have decided what they're going to do with the Benjamites, the very last thing is like, how could we get any lower? Like, there was infighting, there was like, we are worse than Sodom and Gomorrah, like essentially the epitome of what is wrong with the world. And it says, in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did was right in their own eyes. Now I want you to pay attention. I said hill country of Ephraim, which is where the Levite and his concubine, or where the Levite is from at least. And then you have Gibeah, okay? And Gibeah is the town of Benjamin. So here we go. The Levite and his concubine are from the hill country of Ephraim. And then the tragedy that took place is in the town of Gibeah in the region of the Benjamites. Okay, so Samuel, who's going to be the first character that we're introduced to in 1 Samuel, who is thought to be the last judge, sort of a prophet that precedes Saul, is from the hill country of Ephraim. And you're supposed to think, when you're reading, the biblical authors would be like, hill country of Ephraim, remember what just happened in the hill country of Ephraim? Remember when the concubine got cut up? That's where this person is from. Is this person going to be a good person? Is God going to be doing a mysterious thing and saving from this wreckage? Or is something bad going to happen? What the biblical authors are pointing out is it could go either way. And Saul's hometown is Gibeah, where the worst possible thing just happened in the Bible. Saul is from Gibeah, and we're going to see that, and that's going to start to be we wanted this king, we wanted to be just like the rest of them, but for whatever reason, the first king of Israel is from the tribe of Benjamin, from the town of Gibeah. And we're going to be is this foreshadowing? Are bad things going to happen? Or are we going to be surprised, and is God going to redeem this? Ultimately, we know that God's going to redeem this. But there's also, it is, I was shocked, because that was my own Bible study. That was me wondering, I wonder if there's a connection there. Sure enough, as you can see, that rainbow, there are lots of connections. all over the Bible, and you can discover your own, I'm sure, because the Bible is bottomless, and that's what's really cool about it. Okay, so quick summary of 1 Samuel. The book of 1 Samuel chronicles the transition of Israel from a society led by judges to a monarchy, focusing primarily on the lives of the prophet Samuel, the first king Saul, and the eventual choice of David as the next king, highlighting Saul's rise and subsequent fall due to his disobedience, while David is presented as a man after God's own heart, ultimately chosen to lead Israel. So here's where we find if I did my job correctly, because I had technical difficulties.
The books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. There are two separate books in our modern Bibles, but that division is due simply to scroll length. It was originally written as one coherent story. We're just going to cover the book of 1 Samuel in this video. So after Israel was rescued from slavery in Egypt, they made a covenant with God at Mount Sinai and eventually came into the Promised Land. And there, Israel was supposed to be faithful to God and obey the covenant commands. Before the book of Samuel, Judges showed how Israel failed at that task big time. It was a period of moral chaos, and it showed Israel's need for wise, faithful leaders. The book of Samuel provides an answer to that need. The book of Samuel's story focuses on three main characters. The prophet Samuel, where the book gets its name, and then King Saul, and after that, King David. And all three of them transitioned Israel from a group of tribes ruled by judges into a unified kingdom ruled by King David in Jerusalem. And the book of Samuel has a fascinating design that weaves the story of these three characters together in four main parts. Samuel, he's the key leader and prophet in the first section of the book, but then he also plays a key role in the next section, which is Saul's story, and it's told in two movements: Saul's rise to power and then his failures, and the second part is about his downfall and his tragic death. And then the drama of Saul's demise is matched by David's exciting rise to power. And then David's story is told in two movements. First, he rides the wave of his success, followed by his own tragic failure and the slow self-destruction of his family and then his kingdom. The book concludes with an epilogue that reflects back over the whole story. So let's dive in and see how this all unfolds. Part 1 picks up from the chaos of the book of Judges, and we're introduced to a touching story about a woman named Hannah. And she's grieved because she has never been able to have children. And by God's grace, she finally has a son named Samuel. And in joy, she sings this amazing poem in chapter 2. And the poem is all about how God opposes the proud and exalts the humble, about how despite tragedies and human evil, God is working out his purposes in history. And also it's about how God will one day raise up an anointed king for his people. Now, Hannah's poem has been placed here at the beginning of the book to introduce these key themes that we're going to see throughout the whole story, like the next one. Samuel grows up and becomes a great prophet and leader for the people of Israel, at the same time that the Philistines rise to power as Israel's arch nemesis. And in this crucial battle, the Israelites get arrogant, and instead of praying and asking God for help, they trot out the Ark of the Covenant as this kind of magic trophy that will automatically grant them victory in battle. And so because of their arrogant presumption, God allows Israel to lose the battle and the Ark is stolen. So the Philistines, they take the Ark and they place it in the temple of their god, Dagon. And then the God of Israel defeats the Philistines and the god Dagon without an army by sending plagues on the people. And then the Philistines don't want the ark anymore, obviously, and they send it back to Israel. And the point of this little story seems to be this: God is not Israel's trophy, and he opposes pride among the Philistines, but also among his own people. And so Israel needs to remain humble and obedient if they want to experience God's covenant blessing, which opens up into the next large section. The Israelites come to Samuel and they say, hey, we want a king like all the other nations have. Go find one for us. And so Samuel, he's kind of ticked off and he goes to consult with God. And God says, yes, their motives are all wrong, but if a king is what they want, give them one. And so we're introduced to the figure of Saul. Now Saul is a tragic figure because he begins full of promise. He's tall, he's good looking, he's a perfect candidate for a king. But he has deep character flaws. He's dishonest, he lacks integrity, and he seems incapable of acknowledging his own mistakes. And so these flaws become his downfall. He wins some battles at the beginning, but his flaws run so deep, he eventually disqualifies himself by blatantly disobeying God's commands. And so the aging Samuel confronts Saul and Israel. He had warned the people that they would only benefit from a king who's humble and faithful to God. Otherwise, the kings of Israel will bring ruin. So he informs Saul that God is going to raise up a new king to replace him. And so Saul's downfall begins, as God at the same time is working behind the scenes to raise up that new king. It's an insignificant shepherd boy named David. He's the least likely candidate to be king, but the famous story of David and Goliath shows that God's choice of David is not based on his family status, but simply on his radical and humble trust in the God of Israel. And so this story embodies all of the themes of Hannah's poem. Proud Saul and Goliath are brought low, while humble David is exalted. From here, we watch Saul slowly descend into madness, while David rises to power. So David starts working for Saul as a general, and he's winning all of the battles, and he's also winning all of the fame. And so Saul gets jealous, and he starts chasing David around, hunting him, trying to kill him. David's done nothing wrong. And so David simply runs and waits in the wilderness. And here we see David's true character. He has multiple opportunities to kill Saul, but he doesn't. He simply trusts that despite Saul's evil, God will raise up a king for his people. What's interesting, too, is that many of the poems of David that you find in the book of Psalms are linked to this very period of his life, and they all express the same attitude of trust. And so this section of the book ends with Saul coming to a grisly death after losing a battle with the Philistines. 1 Samuel tells some of the most intricate, well-told stories you find anywhere in the Bible. And the characters Saul and David, they're portrayed very realistically. And the author's putting them forward as character studies so that you can find yourself in them. So in Saul's story, we see a warning. It's crucial that we reflect on our own character flaws and how they harm us and other people. And with God's help, we need to humble ourselves and deal with our dark side so that Saul's story doesn't become ours. David, on the other hand, is presented as an example of patience and trust in God's timing in our lives. And so he's running in the wilderness, being chased by Saul. David had every reason to think that God had abandoned him, but that's not what he thinks. And so David's story encourages us to trust that despite human evil, God is working out his purposes to oppose the proud and to exalt the humble. And that's what 1 Samuel is all about.
Okay. All right, obviously we're moving very quickly and there was a lot there. And also as a little, again, to remind you, I'm not a biblical scholar and I don't have, you're probably going to ask a question that might be too hard for me to answer, but I think sometimes it's fun to just talk about the Bible even when biblical scholars aren't present. So does anyone have any initial responses or questions of the video? Yes?
Well, I think we have to be careful of what we ask of God.
Yes.
We wanted a king. God knew it was wrong, but he gave it to him anyway.
Right. Yes, that's exactly right. So what he said was like, we have to be careful what we ask for. God wanted the Israelites wanted a king, and God knew what was going to happen when they gave them a king, but he gave it to them anyways. And that's sort of, kind of shows you that sometimes, like, when we sin, when we want what is wrong, God will let it happen. And sometimes the natural punishment of that wrong thing is sort of how we end up getting punished. So it's sort of what's interesting about the character of Saul is, like, first of all, we know he's from Gibeah, right? And like that's sort of like this foreboding thing, like this guy could be a bad dude. But he's tall, he's handsome, he's confident, and that's what you think that you would want from a king, right? You would want someone who is handsome and tall and powerful and sure of himself. Because you don't want a weakling per se. You want to be like, it's not bad to be those things, certainly. But like what ends up happening, obviously, is Saul is not, ultimately, he is not going to be the vessel that saves Israel from its problems. And then we're introduced to David. And obviously that David has a lot of promise, right? So Saul is from Benjamin, and then David is from the tribe of Judah. So here we have the two remaining tribes. They had not yet, like the 10 other tribes haven't disappeared yet. But we have, like, as our main characters now, a guy from Benjamin and a guy from Judah. And we're going to learn a little bit more about the tribe of Judah in a little bit. Because I think it's very important to sort of talk about Jacob's other name is Israel, his 12 sons, and then we also talk about the 12 tribes of Israel a little bit more. But yeah, it's certainly, that's one of those things where we have our expectation, and then we have the reality. And I think, again, like, the Bible is surprising frequently, which is why you have a lot of Jewish people who know the Bible very well who can't see the surprising elements of Jesus of Nazareth and the fact that he somehow is this incarnate human / God. Like, it's a mystery to us. Like, that's surprising, right? You wouldn't think that there would be someone who is fully human and fully God. But okay, did anyone learn anything new about 1 Samuel? A lot? Yeah, it's a cool story. And yeah, it's certainly, I mean, again, we also know what happens to David, right? Or at least we're going to see what happens to David in 2 Samuel. Okay, let's get going. The book of 2 Samuel in the Bible chronicles the reign of King David of Israel from rise to power to his failures as leader. So here we go.
The book of 2 Samuel. Check out the video on 1 Samuel where we were introduced to the book's three main characters, Samuel, Saul, and David, and then also to the book's literary design, which first introduced Samuel and then traced the rise and fall of King Saul in contrast to the rise of King David. 2 Samuel tells the story of David as Israel's king, and in two movements. There's a season of success and a blessing, followed by a huge moral failure and then its sad consequences. And then the book ends with this well-crafted conclusion that reflects back on the good and the bad in David's life, generating hope for a future king to come from his line. So 2 Samuel picks up after Saul's death, and David surprises everyone by composing this long poem where he laments the death of the very man who tried to murder him. And so once again, the author, he's presenting David's humility and compassion. He's a man who grieves the death even of his own enemies. After this, David experiences a season of success and God's blessing. All of the Israelite tribes, they come to David and then they ask him to unify all the tribes as their king. And so the first thing David does as king is to go to the city of Jerusalem. He conquers it, and he establishes it as Israel's capital city, which he renames as Zion. And from there, David goes on and he wins many battles and expands Israel's territory. Now, after making Jerusalem the political capital of Israel, he wants to make it their religious capital as well. And so he has the Ark of the Covenant moved into the city. And then in 2 Samuel 7, he tells God, now that Israel has a permanent home, he thinks that God's presence should also get a permanent house. So he asks if he can build a temple for the God of Israel. But God says to David, thank you for that thought, but actually I'm going to build you a house, a dynasty. Now, 2 Samuel 7, this is a key chapter for understanding the storyline of the whole Bible. Because God here makes a promise to David that from his royal line will come a future king who's going to build God's temple here on earth and set up an eternal kingdom. And it's this messianic promise to David that gets picked up and developed more in the book of Psalms and also in the books of the prophets. And it's this king that gets connected to God's promise to Abraham. The future messianic kingdom will be how God brings his blessing to all of the nations. And it's right here, in the midst of all this divine blessing, that things go horribly wrong. David makes a fatal mistake. Not fatal for him, but for a man named Uriah, one of David's prized soldiers. So from his rooftop, David sees Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, bathing. David finds her, he sleeps with her, gets her pregnant, and then he tries to cover the whole thing up by having Uriah assassinated and then marrying her. It's just horrible. So when David's confronted by the prophet Nathan about all of this, he immediately owns up to what he's done. He's broken, he repents, he asks God to forgive him, and God does forgive him, but God doesn't erase the consequences of David's decisions. And so as a result of this horrible choice, David's family, his kingdom, it all falls apart. And it makes this section a tragic story, much like Saul's downfall. So David's sons end up repeating his own mistakes, but in even more tragic ways. So Amnon sexually abuses his sister, Tamar, and then their brother, Absalom, finds out about all of this and has Amnon assassinated. And then Absalom goes and he hatches this secret plan to oust his father, David, from power, and he launches this full-scale rebellion. And so for a second time, David is forced to flee from his own home and go hide in the wilderness. Except this time, he is not an innocent man. The rebellion ends when David's son is murdered, when it breaks David's heart. And so once again, he laments over the very man who tried to kill him. David's last days find him back on his throne, but as a broken man, he's wounded by the sad consequences of his sin. The book concludes with a well-crafted epilogue, with stories that are out of chronological order, but they have this really cool symmetrical literary design. So the outer pair of stories come from earlier in David's reign, and they compare the failures of Saul and then of David, and how each of them hurt other people through their bad decisions. The next inner pair of stories are about David and his band of mighty men who went about fighting the Philistines. And what's interesting is that both sections have a story of David's weakness in battle. So in contrast to the victorious David of chapters 1 through 9, here we see a vulnerable David who's dependent on others for help. The center of the epilogue has two poems that act like memoirs, and David reflects back on his life. And he remembers times when God graciously rescued him from danger. And he sees these as moments where God was faithful to his covenant promise to him and to his family. Both poems conclude by looking back onto the hope of God's promise of a future king who will build that eternal kingdom. Now these poems and then God's promise also connect back to Hannah's poem that opened the book. And so these key passages from the beginning, now the middle, and the end of the book bring the book's themes all together. Despite Saul and David's evil, God remained at work, moving forward his redemptive purposes. And God opposed David and Saul's arrogance, but he exalted David when he humbled himself. And so the future hope of this book reaches far beyond David himself. It looks to the future, to the Messianic King who will one day bring God's kingdom and blessing to all of the nations. And that's what the book of Samuel is all about.
Okay. There we go. We saw that in many ways, David was a better king. He fulfilled that sort of messianic vision of what the Savior of Israel is going to be like a little bit more than Saul, but he still doesn't do it. He ends up falling. Again, though, he's sort of the best example of that messianic figure so far in the story. So, like, when they talk about, David is related to Jesus. And every time, like, they talk about the Messiah, especially in the prophets, they talk about they need a new David. They need someone who has a humble heart. So obviously his posture towards God is a better posture than Saul's proud posture. So that's something that we have to keep in mind. That somehow, like, this future king, this Messianic king that's obviously not David, is going to be like, is going to be more like David. He's going to have a humble heart. And we're going to be wondering now. It's like, okay, if it's not David, is it going to be his son? Is it going to be Solomon? And I guess we'll find out in Kings. But does anyone have any initial responses or questions to that particular video? Anyone see any connections? If you don't, that's fine. I'll make some connections for you. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about 2 Samuel 7, 1 through 7. And this is when they're talking about sort of the messianic vision. This is after David has said to God, I'm going to build you a temple. Because I have an awesome house, I have an awesome palace, I want to build you a temple because you're living in a tent right now. And God says, you know what, I'm fine actually living with a tent. I want to build a dynasty for you. So eventually we do get this promise. And I'm going to read this to you because it's a messianic promise, but it's a little bit confusing in some places. After the king was settled in his palace and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him, he said to Nathan the prophet, Here I am, living in a house of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent. Nathan replied to the king, Whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it, for the Lord is with you. But that night the word of the Lord came to Nathan, saying, Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day. I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I say to any of their rulers whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, Why have you not built me a house of cedar? And we're going to skip over some parts. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. Nathan reported to David all the words of this entire revelation. So we know from what the Bible Project has told us that this is a messianic prediction, right? But it's also, from what we as Christians know about Jesus, it's a little bit confusing. Like, one thing it says, when he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands, but my love will never be taken away from him. And obviously we know Jesus did no wrong, but he was inflicted by human hands. He was inflicted with floggings by human hands. So what is Nathan, what is God saying through Nathan right now? Well, I think one thing to keep in mind, one thing I guess I didn't fully understand, especially when reading things like the prophets, when we talk about the messianic predictions, is that oftentimes we're called to have multiple things in our mind at the same time. So there's the particular context that the prophets are speaking to. It's in Isaiah's case, he's talking about them right here, right now. Israel is not living up to the Torah, and they are and at some point a king's going to come. But it's very important to realize that they're not just talking about Jesus per se. They're talking about their particular moment. They're talking about all the bad things that are happening and that they're doing. And in the future, God is going to solve that with a future Messiah. They just don't know yet how. Yes? Nathan's just another prophet. So he's another prophet. Unfortunately, I'm not a biblical scholar to be able to tell you what town he's from. But basically, remember, prophets aren't people that predict the future. Prophets are people that are speaking on behalf of God. That's what prophets are. Yes?
When that last paragraph, that's referring to Christ. How does it possibly say when he does wrong?
Right. Well, I know that, and that's the confusing part, right? Here's the thing: is right now they're talking about right now in their moment, and then also the future. So what we're gonna see from this is that this prophecy, this Nathan speaking for God here is talking both of Solomon, who is David's flesh and blood, who also does have God's blessing, but he does wrong, and he is punished by human hands. And we're going to learn a little bit about that in the book of Kings. But it's also talking about the future Messiah. The Bible is doing multiple things at the same time sometimes. Or at least that's my best explanation of what's going on there. I think when I first started hearing about Isaiah, I heard about it just in the context of they're talking about the future Messiah. They're talking about Jesus here. Yes, they are, but they're also the judgment that God is raining down upon Israel at that time is because they are not following the Torah. It's because they are not living up the way that they did. And on top of that, because they are not following about the Torah, they're going to be exiled into Babylon. The prophets are talking about multiple things sometimes, and the more connections we have in our head, the more we will understand. Because it's we all do this. We can all keep paradoxes in our head. We know that Jesus is fully man. That's what we're about to celebrate up here for Christmas. But somehow, miraculously, he's also fully God. So that's God asking us to keep two things in our head at the same time. And that's not a contradiction. That's a mystery. And that is what we believe about that. But before we get to Kings, I want to talk a little bit about the tribes of Israel. So all the way back in Genesis, first we meet Abraham. His descendants are going to be through whom God saves the world. Then remember, he has the long-awaited Isaac, that came to Abraham and Sarah in their very, very old age, and it wasn't a very clean story. There was a lot of bad things that happened. Abraham and Sarah tried to make Isaac happen by having Sarah's servant sleep with Abraham, and they get another son named Ishmael. But anyways, so Isaac has Jacob, and then Jacob is the guy that actually ends up what's called wrestling with God. There's this story, there's a strange story in the Bible where Jacob starts to wrestle with an angel. And many people believe that God is actually in that angel, somehow mysteriously, maybe even a pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. We don't know. But certainly that angel, perhaps the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ, says that that Jacob's new name is Israel, which means wrestle with God, because that suffix El is another word for God. It's very similar to Elohim, which I don't know if you've ever heard that. So he has 12 sons, but it's not that easy, right? So he has the son that we all know and love is Joseph, because he's the one that sort of featured in many of our Christian Sunday school things. And of course, me as a person assumed that it was probably through Joseph, because he was the good guy. He was the one that was essentially saved all of Egypt. And it's through him that we're going to actually find the Messiah. But no, that's not true. It's through Judah, the fourth born of Leah, who is the unloved wife, when Rachel is the loved wife. And I can't go back to the whole story, but essentially, Judah is not necessarily portrayed as that good of a guy. Certainly, I think he's the one that saves his brother Joseph from death. I think he connives to sell them to the people that are going to Egypt, so he sells them into slavery, but he doesn't kill them, so that's pretty good. But he's certainly not a hero. He's an unexpected person. Leah, produces those 4 sons, and then just to give you another quick. So Leah produces 4 sons. Rachel can't have sons at all, and it's a huge disappointed. So what she ends up doing is she ends up giving Jacob her servant to produce sons. So there we go. Dan and Naphtali are from Rachel's servant, because Rachel's hey, I'm not having sons. I'm jealous that my sister Leah is doing it. So here you go. Then Leah apparently stops having sons, and then gives her servant that, but eventually she is able to have her own again, and then we get Joseph and Benjamin. Okay, so that's just a quick and dirty, like, it's important to understand a little bit about the tribes. The tribes of Israel. So you have the 12 sons of Jacob, and this is another thing that I want to clear up a little bit because it also was confusing and I didn't understand it. You have the 12 sons of Jacob. You have Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. Okay, so those should be the 12 tribes, right? Because those are the 12 sons. Except, no. The tribes are Reuben, Simeon, Ephraim, who's Ephraim, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Manasseh, and Benjamin. Okay, so like the confusing part is like these are the 12 tribes. Levi apparently is not a tribe because Levi's descendants are spread out through the entire land of Israel because they're the priests that essentially are in charge of priestly things. And then Ephraim and Manasseh is a split tribe. These are the two sons of Joseph. So I don't know why that confused me so much, but it's like one of those things where, yeah. But you learn about that a little bit more in depth when Jacob is blessing all of his sons. And here we're going to pick up about Judah again. Here is the so he blesses Ephraim and Manasseh, and he actually, what's interesting is, I don't remember which son is which, but Jacob chooses to bless the younger son over in front of the older son, which is like totally mind-blowing to people. So that's like, we're constantly seeing in the Bible how the younger son is preferred over the older son. And the fact that Judah, by the way, who's the fourth son, is through it's supposed to be blowing our minds. Like, as people who, I don't prefer my own children to like one from the other. Like, I love them all equally. But like in olden time culture, in the biblical culture, like your first son was it. But the Bible is frequently flipping that on its head and saying like, no, it's the younger son that's more important, which is a very interesting concept. But anyways, here's Judah's blessing. Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's son will bow down to you. You are a lion's cub. Judah, you will return from the prey, my son. Like a lion, he crouches and lies down. Like a lioness, who dares to rouse him? The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. He will tether his donkey to a vine, his colt to the choicest branch. He will wash his garment in wine, his robes in the blood of grapes. His eyes will be darker than wine, his teeth whiter than milk. So here we have another messianic promise here. But it's talking about two people. It is both talking about Judah and essentially the seed of Judah, the spawn of Judah, like whoever that is. But the scepter will not depart from Judah. So it's not just Judah, it's Judah's descendants. Just like when they talk about Israel, we're not just talking about Israel, Jacob here. We're talking about their descendants. So we're asked to be like hold two things in our mind. So here is this is where they all ended up. This is what happens in Joshua. They get all their lands, and here you can see Judah is down here at the south. Benjamin is right here. I don't exactly know what happened to Simeon. From what I've heard, they kind of just get absorbed into Judah, and they sort of intermarry. As you can see, and I forget why, Simeon's land was completely surrounded by Judah, and I think that there was some reason for that, but I can't tell you that. But that's where all the action starts to take place. So when the kingdom split, which you're about to see, you have the kingdom of Israel up north and the kingdom of Judah down south. And then essentially these are going to see, like, it's kind of like the Robert Frost poem, the kingdom of Judah chooses the road less traveled by, and Israel kind of goes in a different direction. So that's what we have with Kings. We'll see how much we can get to it. The book of Kings comprised of 1 Kings and 2 Kings because it was originally one book. chronicles the reign of Israelite kings following David's death, focusing primarily on the rise and fall of the United Kingdom under Solomon, its subsequent division into Israel and Judah, and the consequences of their idol worship and disobedience towards God, ultimately leading to the exile of both nations to Babylon and Assyria. The book highlights the prophetic ministries of figures like Elijah and Elisha throughout this period. So here we go, Kings.
The books of 1st and 2nd Kings. Although they're two separate books in our Bibles, they were originally written as one book telling a unified story that continues on from the book of Samuel that came before it. So David has unified the tribes of Israel into a kingdom, and God promised that from his line would come a messianic king who would establish God's kingdom over the nations and fulfill the promises made to Abraham. So the book of Kings tells the story of the long line of kings that came after David, and none of them lived up to that promise. In fact, they run the nation of Israel right into the ground. The book is designed to have 5 main movements. The story begins and ends focused on Jerusalem. First with Solomon's reign and the construction of the temple, and then in this last section ending with Jerusalem's destruction and Israel's exile to Babylon. And the story leading up to this tragedy is what makes up the center 3 sections, which explain how Israel split into 2 rival kingdoms, how God tried to prevent the corruption of Israel by sending the prophets, and how exile became the unavoidable consequence of Israel's sin. The book opens with 2 chapters about the kingdom passing from the aging David to his son Solomon. And David's final words to Solomon, they're very similar to those of Moses and Joshua and Samuel to the people. It's a call to remain faithful to the commands of the covenant and to give allegiance to the God of Israel alone. But David's words ring somewhat hollow here, because David and Solomon then go on to conspire how they're going to consolidate this new kingdom through a whole series of political assassinations. It's not off to a great start. Solomon's brightest moment comes when he asks God for wisdom to lead Israel, and he even completes David's dream to make a temple for the God of Israel. Here the story actually stops and describes the design of this temple in detail, just like the tabernacle design in the Torah. There's all these gold and jewels and depictions of angels and fruit trees, all symbolism echoing back to the Garden of Eden. It's the place where heaven and earth meet, where God's presence dwells with his people. But no sooner does Solomon finish the temple than he makes some really horrible choices, and the kingdom falls apart. He starts marrying the daughters of other kings, hundreds of them, for political alliances. And then he adopts their gods and introduces the worship of those gods into Israel. Solomon then accumulates huge amounts of wealth. He builds a huge army. He even institutes slave labor for all of his building projects. Now, if you go back to the Torah and look at God's guidelines for Israel's kings in Deuteronomy 17, Solomon is breaking every one. So by the time that he dies, Solomon resembles Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, more than he does his father David. The next section of the book opens with Solomon's son, Rehoboam, acting just like his father. It's a very sad story of greed and lust for power. He tries to increase taxes for slave labor. And under the leadership of Jeroboam, the northern tribes reject this, they rebel and secede, and form their own rival kingdom. And so now in the story you have the southern kingdom, Judah, centered in Jerusalem with kings from the line of David, and now this new northern kingdom called Israel, whose capital will be Samaria eventually. Jeroboam also goes on to build 2 new temples to compete with Solomon's temple in the south. He puts a golden calf in each one to represent the God of Israel. The connection to Exodus 32 and the golden calf, it's all quite explicit. From this point on, the story goes back and forth from north to south, tracing the fate of both kingdoms. Each one had about 20 successive kings, and as the author introduces each king, he evaluates their reign by a few criteria. Did they worship the God of Israel alone, or did they promote the worship of other gods? Did they deal with idolatry among people? And did they remain faithful to the covenant like David, or do they become corrupt and unjust? And according to these criteria, the author finds no good kings in northern Israel, 0 for 20, and then in southern Judah, only 8 out of 20 get a positive rating, which connects to another huge purpose in this book, and that's to introduce the role of the prophets, key figures in Israel's history. So in the Bible, prophets were not fortune tellers. Rather, they spoke on behalf of the God of Israel, and they played the role of covenant watchdogs, which means they called out idolatry and injustice among the kings and the people. They were constantly reminding Israel of their calling to be a light to the nations, that they should obey the commands of the Torah, and so the prophets challenged Israel to repent and follow their God. In these center sections for each king, God then raises up prophets to hold them accountable. The most prominent prophets are the northern ones, Elijah and his disciple Elisha, right here in the center of the book. Elijah was a wild man of a prophet living out in the desert, and his arch nemesis was the northern king Ahab and his Canaanite wife Jezebel. Together, these two had instituted the worship of the Canaanite god Baal over Israel. And so in a famous story, Elijah challenged 450 prophets of Baal to a contest to see which god was real. So they both build altars and pray to their gods, but only the God of Israel answers with fire. After this, Ahab uses his royal power to murder an Israelite farmer and then steal his family's vineyard. And Elijah again confronts Ahab's injustice, and he announces the downfall of his house. Elijah eventually passes the mantle of his prophetic leadership to a young disciple named Elisha, who asks for 2 times the authority of Elijah. And what's fascinating here is how the author, he's recounted 7 miraculous feats for Elijah, and then he offers stories of 14 acts of power from Elijah. Both prophets were clearly remarkable men, and they played the same role, confronting Israel's kings for idolatry and injustice. And ultimately, they were unsuccessful in turning Israel back from apostasy. In the next section, the northern kingdom is rocked by a bloody revolution started by a king named Jehu, who destroys Ahab's family. And although Jehu was at first commissioned by God, his violence just gets out of control, and it creates the spiral of political assassinations and rebellions from which Israel never recovered. Coup follows coup after Jehu, and each king follows other gods, allows horrible injustice. It all leads up to 2 Kings chapter 17. The big bad empire of Assyria swoops down and takes out the northern kingdom altogether. In the capital city of Samaria, it's conquered, and the Israelites are exiled and scattered throughout the ancient world. Now, chapter 17 is key. The author stops the story and offers this prophetic reflection on what's just happened. He blames the downfall of the northern kingdom on the idolatry and covenant unfaithfulness of Israel and its kings. And so, God has allowed them to face the consequences of their decisions. The final movement of the book tells the story of the lone southern kingdom. And here we meet some very heroic kings, like Hezekiah, who trusts God when the armies of Assyria come knocking on Jerusalem's door. Or Josiah, who discovers this lost scroll of the Torah in the temple. So he starts reading it, he's convicted, and he institutes religious reforms to remove idolatry and Canaanite influences from the land. But Judah is just too far gone. The king, right in between these two, Manasseh, he's the worst by far. So he not only introduces the worship of idol statues into the Jerusalem temple, he also institutes child sacrifice. And so God sends prophets to say, the time is up. Israel has reached the point of no return. The final chapters tell the story of the Babylonian Empire coming to invade Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and carry the people and the royal line of David off into exile. And so the story ends leaving us wondering, is God done with Israel? Is he done with the line of David? Well, the final paragraph zooms about 40 years forward into the exile, and it tells a very odd story. It's about Jehoiakim, a descendant from David, who would have been king if he was back in Jerusalem. And the king of Babylon releases him from prison and invites him to eat at the royal table for the rest of his life, and the book ends. So it's not much, but it's a story that gives a glimmer of hope that God has not abandoned the line of David. So the question now is, how is God going to fulfill his promises to Abraham, to David? How is he going to bless the nations and bring the Messianic kingdom? And to answer those questions, you have to read on into the wisdom and the prophetic books. But for now, that's the book of Kings.
Okay, obviously it was a lot, but we are going to end now. We're going to talk about the Babylonian exile next, and it's we're going to. I don't know why we don't talk about the exile all that much, but it is foundational for understanding the Old Testament, the whole Old Testament actually. So, anyways, Let me pray for us. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for your word. Thank you that you reveal yourself to us through your word. Thank you for the surprise. Help us to challenge our assumptions. Help us to continue to not rely on ourselves, but to rely on you. Thank you for sending your Son, that he became man, and that's what we're celebrating here at Christmas, the incarnation of your Son, Jesus Christ. We pray that you would bless our Sunday today, that it would be restful for everyone here. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen.